I'll never forget that Christmas. My son and I decided to take a trip to visit my family in a rural area, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The road was covered in snow, and the lights from the houses around us gave off this cozy glow against the cold landscape. We were driving slowly, just soaking in the quiet of Christmas Eve, when suddenly, a terrifying crash shattered the peace. I saw a family of 4 involved in a brutal accident right in front of us. The cars were completely wrecked, and the sound of glass shattering was still echoing in the cold air. Frozen in shock, we got out of the car to try and help. The snow was falling heavily, making it almost impossible to move, and visibility was nearly zero. We cautiously approached the wrecked vehicles, hearing groans of pain and seeing the desperation in the victims' eyes. We tried calling for help, but there was no signal in that remote area. The feeling of helplessness washed over us as we fought against the cold and the panic, realizing we were completely alone in that nightmare. I still remember how the cold seemed to seep into every part of my body. My son was shaking beside me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. We decided to get closer, trying to figure out exactly what had happened. One of the cars was flipped on its side, and the other had been thrown several meters away. The emergency lights were flashing weakly, casting eerie shadows over the freshly fallen snow. The family seemed badly injured, and the air was thick with despair. We tried to assess the situation quickly. The mom was unconscious in the back seat of the first car, while the dad was holding the younger child, clearly in shock. The sound of the wind whistling through the trees only added to the sense of isolation. My heart was racing as I tried to think of how we could help. My son tried calling someone again, but, like I said, there was no signal. The reality of being stuck there with no way out started to hit me, bringing a mix of guilt and helplessness I'd never felt before. The snow kept falling, covering everything in a blanket of white that seemed endless. We decided the best way to help was to try and move the injured people to a safer spot, away from the road where traffic could come at any moment. With effort, we managed to get the dad out of the car, but he was unconscious and struggling to breathe. My heart tightened more and more as I tried to stay calm, but fear started taking over my thoughts. Meanwhile, my son was trying to comfort the younger child, who was clinging to the dad, barely responding to his calls. The tension in the air was palpable, and every sound seemed louder in the quiet of the night. I realized we were running out of time, and the situation could get worse fast. The urgency was eating me up, and the doubt about how we'd get out of there without any help just made the desperation worse. I felt a chill run down my spine when I heard something strange coming from the nearby forest, like someone or something was watching us. The sound we heard seemed to come from all directions at once, an unsettling whisper that mixed with the sharp wind. My son and I exchanged terrified glances, trying to figure out what was happening. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around us, and the shadows of the trees danced in a strange way under the faint light of the makeshift lanterns we managed to light with our phones. Every noise, every crack made our hearts race, and the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't let us rest. We decided the best thing to do was focus on helping the victims and try to stay calm. Carefully, we managed to get the dad on his feet, supporting him so he wouldn't pass out again. The mom was still unconscious, and the youngest child was shaking from the cold and fear. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, not just for their suffering, but also because of the helplessness that was consuming us. That Christmas night, which should have been a time of joy and togetherness, had turned into a cold, lonely nightmare where every second felt like an eternity of uncertainty and fear. The wind started to pick up, making the snow fall even heavier and making it harder to move. We could feel time slipping away, and the hope that someone might pass by was fading with each minute. I decided we needed to find better shelter to protect the victims from the biting cold. With great effort, I started dragging the car up a small hill nearby, trying to create a natural barrier against the storm that was coming. As we worked, the whispers we'd heard earlier came back louder and clearer this time. They sounded like voices, but I couldn't make out any clear words. My son was holding the hand of the injured boy tightly, and I could feel the growing tension all over my body. I decided it was better for us to focus on keeping the victims stable and waiting for the storm to pass. But the feeling that we weren't alone kept haunting us, making it impossible to fully relax, even in the chaos around us. As the storm grew stronger, the feeling of helplessness grew with it. We decided to take shelter inside the car, trying to shield ourselves from the relentless wind and the snow that seemed endless. The inside of the car was freezing, and we could hear the structure creaking under the force of the gale. We kept everyone warm with the coats we had, but the cold still seeped into our bones. My son was close by, holding the injured boy's hand so gently that I could see the concern in his young, determined face. While we were inside the car, the whispers came back, closer and more disturbing than before. It sounded like they were coming from all around us, echoing through the dense forest that surrounded us. My heart raced with every strange sound, and the feeling that something or someone was watching us wouldn't leave me alone. We tried to stay focused on keeping calm and helping the victims, but the tension in the air was palpable. That Christmas night, which should have been a time of togetherness and joy, was turning into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The wind seemed to be picking up even more, making the car shake and creak as if it was about to fall apart at any moment. Suddenly, the lights on our phones started to flicker, blinking on and off before shutting down completely. I was left in the dark, except for the faint moonlight that managed to seep through the windows. That's when my son pointed to the side of the road, where an indistinct figure seemed to be watching us from the shadows. My heart raced, and a wave of panic washed over me, but I tried to stay calm so I wouldn't scare my son anymore. We decided to stick together and protect each other from the cold and the growing fear. The silence inside the car was deafening, broken only by the sound of the wind and our own racing heartbeats. Suddenly, we heard a sharp noise coming from the hood, like something was being dragged through the snow. My son squeezed my hand tightly, and I could see the fear reflected in his eyes. We tried to make sense of what was happening, but the heavy atmosphere and the dancing shadows in the darkness around us made it impossible to stay logical. It felt like we were trapped in a nightmare with no escape, the sense that something terrible was about to happen at any moment. The early morning arrived quietly, as if the world had stopped to watch us. The storm finally started to let up, and the snow stopped falling as suddenly as it had begun. We took the chance to warm up a bit, holding on to the hope that the dawn would bring help. As we watched the darkness slowly give way to the faint light of morning, I noticed that the whispers had stopped, leaving only the distant sound of the wind dying down. The feeling of relief mixed with disbelief about what we had experienced that Christmas night. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw lights in the distance. A rescue team was arriving, responding to an emergency call that had finally been made by another driver who passed by the road. With the team's help, we managed to stabilize the injured and get to safety. Even though we were out of danger, the memory of that night remains vivid in my mind. To this day, I can't explain the whispers or the feeling that we were being watched. That Christmas was marked by a tragedy that brought two families together in the midst of desperation, leaving emotional scars we still carry. Sometimes, when the snow falls and the nights are especially quiet, I still feel the chills from that experience, as if the past has never really ended.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
It was Christmas Eve, and the house was wrapped in a comforting calm. The lights on the trees in the yard flickered gently, and the smell of freshly baked cookies filled the air. My son was peacefully asleep in his room, rocked by the soft sounds of Christmas music coming from the living room. Our dog, Thor, had always been a calm and friendly animal, loving to be close to the family, especially the kids. But that night, something felt off. As I watched Thor rest beside me, I noticed he started growling in an unusual way, staring intently at the room where my son was sleeping. My heart raced with worry. I'd never seen Thor act like this before. I decided to get up and check what was going on, trying to stay calm so I wouldn't scare my little one. I slowly opened the door to the room, but everything seemed normal. The room was peaceful, and my son was still sleeping soundly. Still, the tension in the air had me on edge. After I closed the door, I went back to the living room, but the unease lingered. Thor was still staring down the hallway, growling in a way that felt threatening. I decided to turn on every light in the house to see if something was hiding in the shadows, but everything looked fine. The silence of Christmas night, usually so comforting, now felt heavy, filled with tension. My heart was pounding, and an unsettling feeling crept over me, as if we were being watched. I tried to calm Thor by calling him gently and petting his head, but he just curled up, never taking his eyes off the hallway. I started wondering if I was missing something unusual about that night. I went to check the yard through the windows, but all the outside lights were on, lighting up every corner. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, Thor's aggressive behavior didn't make any sense. A chill ran down my spine, and the peacefulness of Christmas was slowly turning into a silent nightmare. I decided not to let fear take over and tried to focus on the Christmas spirit. I went into the kitchen to bake more cookies for Santa, trying to shake off the unease. As I mixed the dough, I could hear Thor pacing back and forth through the house, still on edge. The sound of his heavy footsteps echoed in the silent house, making each beat of my heart feel louder. I looked out the window again, this time trying to distract myself with the colorful lights of the decorations, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away. When I returned to the living room, I noticed Thor wasn't in his usual spot. My heart raced again as I searched the house. I called for him several times, but he didn't answer. He was just silent, staring intently out the window. I decided to step outside into the yard, hoping to find him there. But the night was clear, and there was no sign of the dog. Then I heard a faint sound coming from the garden, like soft footsteps in the fresh snow. My body froze, and a wave of fear washed over me, making me realize that this Christmas night would be unlike any other. I stepped cautiously into the backyard, keeping my eyes fixed on the darkness surrounding our house. The snow covered the ground, muffling the sounds, but the footsteps kept coming, now closer and more defined. My heart raced as I tried to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. Thor, who had always been by my side, started barking fiercely, his fur bristling, reflecting the faint light that made its way through. I felt a mix of relief and panic, seeing that he was finally reacting to the possible threat. I decided to call the police, my voice trembling as I conveyed the urgency of the situation. While waiting for the officers to arrive, I stayed by the front door, watching for any suspicious movement in the yard. The minutes felt like hours, and the tension was unbearable. Thor stayed alert, his eyes never leaving the horizon. When I finally heard the sirens approaching, a sense of security began to slowly return. However, even with the threat seemingly gone, the unease lingered, leaving me questioning whether we were truly safe on that Christmas night. As the police moved around the house, asking quick questions and checking every room, I felt a mix of relief and frustration. They didn't find anything suspicious at that moment, but the feeling that something was wrong still wouldn't go away. I went back inside, trying to get back to normal, but the silence now felt even more oppressive. My son was still asleep, oblivious to what had been happening, and Thor remained in his usual spot, but with a distant and uneasy look in his eyes. I decided to call my neighbors to see if anyone else had felt anything strange that night. The calls revealed that in recent days, a few homes in the neighborhood had been broken into, but no one had seen or heard anything suspicious. That explained the tension Thor had been showing, but it also heightened my fear. I realized that our dog, always so loyal and protective, might have been trying to alert us to an invisible threat. The Christmas night, which should have been one of peace and joy, was slowly turning into a silent nightmare, and I couldn't understand how Thor knew something we all had missed. As I tried to process everything that was happening, I heard a creak coming from the garage. My heart almost jumped out of my chest. There was no reason for anyone to be entering our house, especially at this time of night. I gripped my phone tightly, feeling my hands shake, and decided to investigate. I moved slowly toward the garage, each step feeling heavier than the last. Thor, still on edge, followed closely behind me, growling softly, as if sensing something I couldn't see. I reached the garage door and pushed it open carefully. The internal light was off, but the cold night air seeped in through the cracks. Nothing seemed out of place. but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I went back to the living room, trying to rationalize what I had seen, but my mind wasn't cooperating. I decided to lock all the doors and windows again, making sure we were as safe as possible. Even so, the unease lingered, and the silent presence of the invisible threat made that Christmas night even more terrifying. I sat down on the couch, trying to calm my mind, but the distant sound of footsteps in the snow still echoed in my head, reminding me that we were far from being truly safe. I decided to try to sleep, even though my mind was still racing from the events of the night. I set my phone to speed dial, just in case I needed to call the police again. The silence returned to the house, but the feeling that something was wrong lingered. I lay in bed, watching the blinking lights of the Christmas tree through the window. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the unsettling thoughts, but every sound, every shadow seemed to amplify my fear. Thor lay beside me, still alert, as if he too couldn't relax. Hours passed without incident, and the sun began to rise on the horizon, signaling the end of that terrifying night. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. That's when I woke up to a soft noise coming from my son's room. I got up slowly, my heart racing, and went to check. The room was exactly as I had left it, with my son still sound asleep. But when I looked to the side, I saw Thor staring intently at the window, where a dark silhouette quickly disappeared into the morning light. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't make sense of what had really happened that Christmas night. To this day, I still can't explain Thor's behavior or the presence of that fleeting shadow, leaving me with more questions than answers.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've always liked helping people, especially around that time of year, Christmas, when the world feels colder, both in terms of the weather and people. It was my third year volunteering at a homeless shelter, and up until that day, I'd never really thought twice about safety or being scared while I was there. It felt like something so far removed from the usual chaotic but still welcoming vibe of the shelter. But that day, it felt off from the moment I walked in. The air seemed heavy, like something bad was about to happen, but I shrugged it off. I figured it was just the exhaustion from rushing around to finish my Christmas shopping before my shift. As soon as I walked in, I ran into John, not his real name, but I'll call him that, sitting near the entrance. He was always around. He was a big guy, with a messy beard and eyes that seemed like they never stopped sizing you up. John had a complicated past, He'd gotten into trouble a few times, mostly over drinking and fighting with other residents. He wasn't an easy guy to deal with, but I tried to treat him like I treated everyone there, with respect. But that morning, he looked at me in a way that made me uncomfortable, like he knew something I didn't. And the worst part was, he didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring, while I went to the volunteer room to grab my apron and get ready for my shift. After that weird first interaction, I tried to shake off the bad feeling and got to work organizing things in the cafeteria. The morning was busy, with other volunteers serving coffee and handing out winter clothes. But every time I looked up, there he was, John, watching me from across the room. He wasn't eating, he wasn't talking to anyone, he was just staring. It was starting to get to me, but I tried to stay focused. He must be having a rough day, I thought, trying to talk myself down. But it got harder to ignore when he started showing up everywhere I went. I'd go to the pantry to grab more milk. There he was, standing in the hallway. I'd step outside to help unload a car full of donations. He was on the corner, smoking and staring straight at me. The discomfort was building up, minute by minute. Around 11 in the morning, he finally approached me. I was outside trying to organize some food boxes when I felt his presence behind me. When I turned around, he was there, so close I could smell the strong scent of alcohol on him. "You think you're better than us, huh?" he muttered, his tone a little rough. I tried to stay calm, told him I was there to help and that I wasn't looking for trouble, but he gave me this strange smile, like my response only annoyed him more. "You think you can help, but you don't know anything about us," he said, and then just stood there, as if waiting for me to do something. My heart was racing, and the only thing I could do was step back inside the building and look for another volunteer. No one seemed to notice how different he was acting that day. After that, I tried to keep myself busy, but every time he showed up, it felt like the tension kept building. It got to the point where I was paying more attention to him than to my own work. At one point, while I was organizing dishes for lunch, I heard a loud noise coming from the dorm hallway. My stomach dropped. When I went to check, I saw John pushing one of the doors open forcefully, like he was looking for someone or something. He didn't see me at first, but when he noticed I was there, he stopped. For a second, I thought he was going to head back to the cafeteria, but instead, he made a point of walking toward me, slowly, with his eyes narrowed. "You think you can run from me?" he said, almost in a whisper. My body froze. That hallway was empty, and the exit seemed way too far. I rushed to the volunteer room and told one of the coordinators what had happened. She sighed and said John had always been complicated, but it was probably just the stress of the season. I didn't know how to respond. "What do you mean, stress?" The guy was clearly intimidating me, and no one seemed to take it seriously. The coordinator said she'd check it out, but that didn't reassure me at all. It didn't even take 10 minutes for me to realize he was looking for me again. I started avoiding empty places and sticking close to other volunteers or the calmer residents. But even then, every time John passed by, he'd whisper something I couldn't make out or give me that strange smile. It was like he knew exactly how to make me terrified. The situation peaked in the afternoon when I went to the storage room to grab more supplies for the Christmas dinner. The shelter was packed, and everyone was busy getting ready for the special meal. I felt a bit safer being surrounded by people, but as soon as I stepped into the storage room, I realized I was alone. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, there he was again, standing in the doorway, blocking the only exit. He was holding a can of soda in his hand, but it seemed more like an excuse to be there. My heart raced, and I started talking, trying to defuse the situation. "Need something, John? Can I help?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring, tilting his head side to side like he was studying every move I made. Suddenly, he dropped the can on the floor, the sound echoing through the storage room. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice deep and full of anger. In that moment, I was sure he was about to do something. Instinctively, I grabbed a bag of rice to protect myself, as if that would help. John took 2 steps toward me, and I felt cornered. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, when out of nowhere, one of the other volunteers appeared in the doorway, calling my name. John froze. He looked at the volunteer, then at me, and walked out without saying another word. It happened so fast, I didn't know how to react. I just remember grabbing the supplies and getting out of there as fast as I could, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the boxes. After that, I decided I needed to talk to the shelter management again. I waited for the right moment, and when I saw the coordinator alone, I explained in detail what had just happened in the storage room. This time, I was more firm. I told her this wasn't just holiday stress, and that he was a real threat, both to me and to the others. But, to my frustration, she just nodded like it was another routine incident. "We're overwhelmed," she said. "It's hard to keep everything under control." I wanted to scream. How could they ignore something so obvious? I went back to the main hall, trying to act like everything was fine, but I knew I wasn't safe. And, worse, I felt like no one would take me seriously until something worse happened. As the day went on, I realized John kept wandering around the shelter, like nothing had happened. I tried to keep my distance, but he always seemed to know where I was. I started wondering if he did this to other people, or if it was something personal with me. The feeling of being constantly watched and followed was making me paranoid. The worst part came when the sun began to set, and the shelter grew quieter. Less noise, fewer people around. It was like the environment was conspiring to amplify my fear. I spent the last minutes of my shift staring at the clock, counting the seconds until I could leave. When the time finally came, I practically ran out, feeling his eyes on me until I reached the door. I didn't look back. I thought that once I left the shelter, I'd feel safe again, but it was the opposite. As I walked to the bus stop, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The streets were decorated for Christmas, with lights twinkling and music playing in the distance, but none of it comforted me. Every time I passed a store window or glanced behind me, I felt like John was nearby, even though I couldn't see him. When I finally reached the bus stop, I stood there, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. It wasn't until the bus arrived that I noticed something. In the last row of seats, looking out the window, there he was. John. I don't know how he got there before me, but there he was, staring at me with that blank look. The worst part was when I got on the bus. I had no choice but to sit down. He didn't move, but it was impossible to ignore his presence. Every time the bus swayed or stopped, I could feel my body tense up. He didn't do anything, absolutely nothing. He just sat there like he knew exactly what kind of effect he was having. When my stop came, I hurried off, practically running through the streets of my neighborhood. When I looked back, the bus was already far away, and he was still inside, staring out the window. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about everything that had happened, trying to piece it all together. Why was he following me? Why hadn't anyone at the shelter done something? And, most terrifying of all, what would have happened if the other volunteer hadn't shown up in the storage room? In the days that followed, I tried to avoid the shelter. I sent a message to the coordinator, explaining that I needed some time off because of what had happened, but I didn't go into details. Still, the feeling that he was around never went away. To this day, I don't know if it was just paranoia or something more, but I started noticing little signs that kept me on edge. Heavy footsteps on the street at night, shadows that seemed to follow me, and once, even a note left on my gate with the words, "You can't run." I wasn't sure if it was from John or just some weird coincidence, but it was enough to make me change my routine completely. I avoided going out alone and started distancing myself from places I used to go, including the shelter. To this day, I don't know what motivated that behavior or why he chose to intimidate me. What scares me the most is how everything stopped as suddenly as it started. There was no final confrontation, no explanation, nothing. John simply disappeared. I never heard anything else about him at the shelter, and the few fellow volunteers I stayed in touch with said he just stopped showing up. Part of me wants to believe he just moved on, but another part of me can't forget that look, like he knew something I would never understand. I still think about it, especially at Christmas, when the lights and decorations fill the streets again. It's a constant reminder that sometimes even the most beautiful time of the year can't hide the darker side of people.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.